Okay, let's dive into an absolutely wild, almost forgotten moment in history. We're talking about a story that has it all: a steamboat, a rebellion, and a single act of violence that came this close to pushing two global superpowers into an all-out war.
So, let's set the scene. The date is December 29th, 1837. And you have to imagine, the border between the United States and what was then British-controlled Canada, well, it's just electric with tension. A rebellion had just been put down, but the embers, they were still glowing red hot. And then, under the cover of darkness, a group of Canadian militia does something incredibly bold. They cross the Niagara River. Now, their target isn't a military fort or anything like that. Nope, it's a civilian steamboat, the Caroline, just sitting there, docked at a wharf in Fort Schlosser, New York. And let's be crystal clear, this is American territory.
The raid itself, it's swift, it's brutal, shots ring out in the night, and when the smoke finally clears, an American citizen, a man named Amos Durfee, is lying dead on the dock. Then they set the steamboat on fire, cut it loose, and it becomes this terrifying, fiery spectacle drifting towards the roar of Niagara Falls.
And as you can imagine, this single act of violence spiraled out of control almost instantly. There's a fantastic quote from a contemporary account that just nails it. It says, "The fire on the Caroline threatened to ignite a much, much larger blaze. A war between the United States and the entire British Empire."
So, that's the big question here, right? How on earth did a failed Canadian rebellion, led by just one guy, blow up into an international crisis that had diplomats in London and Washington just completely holding their breath? All right, let's break it all down.
So if you want to understand how this raid even happened, you first have to get to know the man at the very center of this storm, William Lyon Mackenzie. This guy was a Scottish-born journalist, a politician, and maybe most importantly, an absolutely relentless agitator for change.
Mackenzie was smart. He used his newspaper, The Colonial Advocate, like a political weapon, just constantly railing against the ruling class of what was then called Upper Canada. And you know what? He was so good at it, so effective, that he actually got elected to the Legislative Assembly. He took his fight from the printed page right into the halls of power.
So who was he fighting against? Well, it was this group called the Family Compact. And you should really just think of them as a super exclusive, tight-knit club of wealthy families who controlled, well, everything. The courts, the banks, all the government jobs. And from their point of view, Mackenzie wasn't some noble reformer. No way. He was a dangerous, dangerous radical.
And this quote, man, it just gets to the very heart of the whole conflict. For the people who followed him, Mackenzie was a patriot. But to the government, he was a traitor. It's a fine line, right? Well, as we're about to see, Mackenzie was going to put that distinction to the ultimate test. So Mackenzie tried politics, but it didn't get him the reforms he wanted. So what's next? Armed rebellion. But here's the thing, that rebellion failed, too. But Mackenzie, he didn't give up, not even close. He just changed the battlefield from Canada to right across the border in the United States. And from here, things just escalated with incredible speed. So his rebellion gets crushed, and Mackenzie flees to Buffalo, New York. But here's the twist. A lot of Americans who were, still pretty skeptical of the British after their own revolution, they greeted him like a hero. He immediately starts recruiting these American sympathizers to his cause. And their plan? It was wild. They were going to occupy Navy Island, right in the middle of the Niagara River, and use it to stage an invasion of Canada.
But okay, think about it. An army on an island needs stuff. It needs food, it needs weapons, it needs more recruits. And to ferry all that over from the American side, Mackenzie's forces hired a small, pretty unremarkable American steamboat. Its name, the Caroline. And just like that, this little boat became the single most important vessel on the Great Lakes.
And this brings us right back to that fateful night. See, the Canadian authorities, they weren't looking at the Caroline and seeing a civilian vessel. To them, it was a pirate ship. It was the lifeline for a rebel army that was about to invade their country. So they made a decision. They were going to cut that lifeline.
From a military perspective, the raid was a success for the Canadians. But diplomatically, it was a complete catastrophe. And honestly, the story might have just ended there, as a really tense but ultimately contained border incident. But then, 3 years later, a Canadian guy named Alexander McLeod is in a tavern in New York, and he's allegedly bragging about how he was part of the raid and that he helped kill Amos Durfee. Well, someone overheard him, and just like that, he was arrested and charged with murder and arson.
And all of a sudden, this isn't about a bar brawl or a local crime anymore. This is an international showdown. I mean, from the American point of view, it was simple. A foreign military invaded our territory and murdered one of our citizens. Case closed. But for the British, their argument was that MacLeod was a soldier, acting under orders, in a totally legitimate act of national self-defense against a bunch of pirates. And their point was, you can't just try a soldier for murder for committing an act of war.
I mean, the stakes just could not have been any higher. Britain demanded that MacLeod be released immediately, and they threatened war if he was executed. But the U.S. federal government had a problem. They argued they couldn't just step in and interfere with New York State's justice system. So think about that. The fate of one single man sitting in a New York jail could literally trigger a war between the U.S. and the British Empire.
But what about the man who kicked this whole thing off? While all the diplomats were scrambling to stop a war from breaking out, William Lyon Mackenzie was on his own wild journey. And believe me, his story is about to take another completely unbelievable turn.
I mean, just look at this timeline. It's nuts. First, in an attempt to cool things down, the U.S. government arrests him for violating their neutrality laws. So in 1839, he's in a U.S. prison. But just a year later, he's pardoned by the President of the United States. Then, and this is the incredible part, by 1849, the Canadian government has become more reform-minded, and they grant him amnesty. He goes home, not to a prison, but to a new political career. And by 1851, this is the kicker. The man once branded a traitor with a 1,000-pound bounty on his head is re-elected to the Canadian Parliament. I mean, you really just can't make this stuff up.
And what about that international crisis he sparked? Well, fortunately, with the whole world watching, cooler heads managed to prevail. The trial itself actually gave everyone an out. MacLeod was acquitted because he had a rock-solid alibi. And with the immediate threat of his execution off the table, the diplomats could finally sit down and work out a peaceful settlement. The war was averted.
You know, in the end, this whole bizarre, violent episode didn't actually break the relationship between the U.S. and Britain. If anything, it redefined it. It was like a massive stress test that forced both countries to create much clearer rules about national sovereignty and, what to do when threats spill across the border.
And that's really the biggest legacy of this whole thing. The Caroline Affair created a huge principle in international law, something we now call the Caroline Doctrine. Basically, it says that a country can only take preemptive military action on someone else's soil if the threat is, and this is the official language, instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. This all raises a question that nations are still wrestling with today. When is a country really justified in crossing a border to take out a threat? That very question was born in the flames of a burning steamboat, and honestly, it's one we're all still trying to answer.